All right. Our next presentation is on the impact of enterprise architecture assimilation on the organizational performance of the federal government. This is co-authored by Dr. Kalle Lyytinen and George Makiya. It's actually going to be presented by George, so let me give him the introduction. And I apologize for not introducing Jeannie before, but I don't think she needs introduction to this group of people. George is the CSE CTO for the Cargill Incorporated account. He has been with CSE since 1999 and worked in the enterprise architecture group of CSE since 2003, where he was responsible for 17 major accounts, including some big names like DuPont, General Dynamics, and so on. George's career spans over 16 years in ERP support and architecture, including engagements with SAP, PeopleSoft, and Oracle, as well as 5 years in pre- and post-mergers acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions advisory. So I think maybe you need to talk to Jeannie about her next book. George is currently pursuing a doctorate in management at Case Western Reserve University. He holds a master's in information management from Syracuse University, a master's in e-business from the University of Newcastle in Australia, and a BS in information systems from Strayer University. I give you George.
So since I don't know the audience here, except a few of you that I've met over the last couple of hours, I've got a great idea. Why don't we do a small quiz? Very, very small quiz. I think this should be, I see there are some academics here, so this might be really tough for some of you, but excuse for that. Okay, so how about that? Let's get started. So, number one, which one of the following is the definition of enterprise architecture? Is it A, a proprietary methodology for enterprise rent-a-car? B, is it a crystal ball for IT and business alignment? Or C, is it a strategic planning approach for aligning business and strategy? Anyone? Okay, how many vote for A? By a show of hands, A? B? Oops. C? Okay, the correct answer is C. All right, next. Ginny, Rose, Peter Will, and David Robertson's classic enterprise architecture book, which I believe is in circulation today, is titled, is it A, IT Doesn't Matter? Or B, Enterprise Architecture for Dummies? Or C, Enterprise Architecture Strategy? By a show of hands, A, B, C. Bingo. Okay. And this is for the ladies in the audience. Whoever answers this correctly gets Jeannie's book, an autographed copy. So the ladies in the audience, enterprise architecture was introduced as an innovation into the federal government. Is it A, as a weapon of mass destruction? B, as an act of Congress? Or C, to re-architect all federal buildings? Ladies, anyone? Yes? B? Now how do you get your own book autographed by yourself? Okay, thank you very much. So now let me get to the meat of it. Okay, so enterprise architecture, unfortunately, is known for this: complex wiring diagrams and a very excited and motivated executive audience that's very attentive. And these are normal headlines, at least if you read all the publications that cover the US federal government in IT. These are not news. This is something that hits, and especially for politicians, this is fodder. Every political election cycle, we hear of this. And now, it's even become a cottage industry for books. And that's just the sad situation. unfortunately, very few people pay attention to this, that it's used by IT executives. It's expanding market share. Banks' profits are growing as a result of that. We're talking about healthcare reform. How are they going to reform when after centuries of doing it manually, they've not been able to do it? And then look at that. But IT gets the footnote coverage. When I mentioned Ginny's book to some executives, are like, as what? Strategy? Now, all we have so far is anecdotal evidence that enterprise architecture does make any contribution to organizational performance. And that's a sad situation. That's part of the motivation for conducting this research. We have case studies. We've had a few stories here and there covered either in CIO magazine or others. But we've never had anyone conduct an empirical study that's backed up by solid data to show us the true impact of enterprise architecture on anything. So this is the very first research that's been conducted over a time frame of 9 years, where we collected data for 9 years, analyzed, took it through statistical analysis, and actually came up with some fairly interesting results. Let's talk about mission. Now, what we are talking about here is mission performance. When you talk of the government's mission, what's the cardinal mission of the government? It's national security. And this is a sad situation right here. When we're talking about the FBI, and this is in 2005, they did not have an enterprise architecture. And the report says they lack management structures and processes. And look at this, information sharing. That looks very familiar. After 9/11, the coverage was, or rather the news at the time was, the various security agencies were not connected. They were not sharing information. They had disparate databases. We heard about WikiLeaks. Guess what? The E-Government Act actually talks about preservation of government information. That's 2002. WikiLeaks happened in 2009. That tells you how far or how well recognized enterprise architecture is. Now, let me take a moment and go through the operationalization that we used here. First and foremost, we conceptualized the federal government as a conglomerate, regardless of the dysfunctional nature of the federal government. 3 disparate arms that are supposed to countercheck or counterbalance each other. But we wanted to go there because this is the practical approach. Some of you work in very large organizations. I think I saw IBM here. IBM has almost 400,000 employees. That's like the Department of Health and Human Services, or even the Department of Commerce, which has got all the cats and dogs in there. You've got the weather service in there. You've got the trade department in there, the census and population in there. I mean, there's everything under the Department of Commerce. Name it and you'll find it there. So that's a conglomerate just like any other practical private sector organization. So assimilation is our focus today. And I want to make this very clear. We are talking about assimilation. So we are talking a stage above what Ginny was talking about. So Ginny's presentation was a very good segue for what we are discussing now. We're not talking about adoption. We're not talking about diffusion. We are talking about assimilation. And so the most pertinent definitions we found are these, where it becomes routinized in the activities. So it becomes part of the routine. So you're dealing at the lowest level possible of the organization. And here it says that it's an integral part of the organization's value chain. So we are going down in the weeds in terms of business processes. This is where we are focusing our attention on, not the adoption stage, not the diffusion stage. And then EA assimilation. Ginny's presentation said maturity matters. Now, as opposed to Ginny's 4-stage model, the federal government has a 5-stage model. Actually, they introduced the 6th one last year. It's yet to be fully rolled out. But let's look at maturity level 5. it says investments must align with mission objectives. We are talking about mission. And then it talks about tracking and measuring benefits or return on investment. That's going to be key. Now, we are talking about the federal government, so granted, we are not going to look at profits or we're not going to look at return on investment the way that we traditionally measure it in the private sector. We're looking at other kind of efficiencies. Now, this is a rather interesting one. We're looking at regulative institutional pressure. In 2001, President Bush announced the President's Management Agenda. That redefined government's mission. He changed government mission to be customer-centered. So the American citizens will be treated just like any other private sector organization treats its customer base. It was going to be responsive to the public. It renamed the framework. Now, when Congress introduced enterprise architecture, they came up with a framework and told the agencies, go ahead and implement. Well, guess what? The E-Government Act actually had them refocus from agency focus to federal. So instead of just being siloed as they were going to be judged at a federal level because they had to jointly support the mission. Then the OMB was introduced as the focal point to manage the assimilation. And they used a carrot and stick approach. I'll explain that on the next slide, this carrot and stick. Maybe you'll understand better when I say that. Now, this is very, very important. They were going to display each agency's scores online. Now, that's pressure. You know why? Most agency bosses are political appointees. Who would like to be at the front, at the headlines every day that they're lagging behind on anything? That's political pressure. That's what we mean by pressure. And then business cases were a must, and they must demonstrate resource sharing, reuse across agency boundaries, not just your own. You had to demonstrate that you're actually leveraging other agencies or sharing either data centers or applications, whatever it was, because the aim here was to reduce the cost of running IT and creating portfolios around lines of business and customers. So this is the picture we have. By 2001, only 5% of the federal agency enterprise architecture programs were considered mature. 5%. And we're talking about since 1996. That's 5 years. We had only that. So these were low. So e-government is introduced in 2002. And by the time we collected the data here, 33% were considered high. But I want you to pay particular attention to this. There's a congressional mandate, because we're looking at two distinct periods here. If I should have drawn a line here, that would have been better. But we're going to compare this period and this period. Because here we are saying that the congressional mandate, yes, it was a mandate, but how far did it go? They put the GAO in charge. The GAO reports to Congress. What about the executive agencies? They report to the executive branch. What about the FBI and others? They report to Department of Justice. So you've got three arms of government, and Congress only has that much of a reach. So they had no punitive powers over the agencies that never reported to them. That's part of the reason why we still had this. But once you introduce the OMB, and the OMB is under the executive, they had sanctional powers. They could slash budgets. If you did not comply, they would expose you. Then we see some movement. Now, I want you to pay particular attention to this line because this is exactly what Ginny talked about. Digitization. The customer base, which is the US citizens, they were changing demographic. The younger generation want to deal with the government via internet. They don't want to walk to brick and mortar offices. They want online services. So a report showed that this number was growing. By 2006, at least We are talking about almost 80% of American citizens really wanted to deal with the government electronically. So it called for transformation. And the budget was growing, so this was the fodder for politicians. Customer satisfaction scores were going up. Then we went, what do they mean customer satisfaction goes up? So we looked for that. Where did we find that? American Customer Satisfaction Index. How many have heard of ACSI? Very few people. But when you transact with the federal government online, any of the agencies, there's a survey at the end of it. And that survey covers practically everything you'd expect in terms of service provision. Did you get the relevant information? How was the transaction? Was it secure enough? So all the investments in cybersecurity and online transaction processing, all that factored into this. And then maturity was also going up. And this is agency-level data. So this was the basis of our research. Can we find a correlation between these? So we came up with two research questions. The first was, what factors influence these maturity levels or assimilation? Now, we had conducted a qualitative study in the spring of 2008. Spring of 2009, all the way until early last year. And we interviewed federal CIOs, federal chief enterprise architects, heads of departments, CFOs. We got some agency directors. And they identified a set of factors. But on top of it, we went back to the GAO assessments, which had been conducted in 2001, 2003, and 2006, where they identified certain factors. So we wanted to find out if those factors really exist and how relevant were they in determining EA assimilation. Next was whether that assimilation was actually driving any mission performance. Is that investment worth it? The government had spent $688 billion to satisfy American citizens. Is that investment and that push in maturing those programs, that assimilation push, was it really leading to any performance improvement? So we went to the literature, using that subset, but also now looking to see which other factors have been cited. And we came across Ginny's book and her case studies. We looked at Professor Scott Barnard, other big names in this field. And we found a subset of factors that had been identified through rigorous studies to affect enterprise architecture adoption, diffusion, implementation, name it. But we found very limited in terms of anything to do with enterprise architecture. So we went back again and looked, and the definition of enterprise architecture, in fact, in its introduction, it's an innovation. It was an administrative innovation. So we found the literature on innovation assimilation. So we took that subset of factors and said, hey, why don't we go and look at other theories? So we found assimilation of innovation, institutional theory, and we came up with some propositions. So the first was that organizational complexity. When you talk of the federal government, in the same sentence, you'll come across complexity. That goes without saying. There'll be bureaucracy, the hierarchical system. And we thought, naturally, that's something we need to test. Next was that the organizational environment. What environment do they operate in? Now, okay, the environment here is a bit different in the operationalization. There are some federal agencies that are autonomous, totally autonomous. Like we've got the IRS, we've got the US Postal Service. They are a standalone organization. They do not report directly to any other agency other than the president. We've got those kind of agencies. We've got those which are sub-agencies beneath the departments or other agencies, and then we've got bureaus. So we wanted to look at, do those environments, does that environment count? Program challenges. Now that we already talked to the program leaders, they had enumerated a number of challenges. We also hypothesized that they will negatively impact the relationship between complexity and assimilation. And then also, again, between the organizational factors, I should have actually written there environment factors and EA assimilation. And then that EA assimilation will positively influence mission performance. And the last one was that the pressure we talked about would influence the relationship. So this was our conceptual model. And as you can see, this was one of the focal points. We wanted to see this relationship and how this affects that, and wanted to see these factors. So this and that were the organizational factors that we had directly influencing that. And then we wanted the program challenges to act as some kind of influencers within that relationship. And these are the sources of the data. Now, this data was collected over 4 years. I began collecting that data even before I began the program, but for a different reason. At the time, I was interested in what Ginny had talked about maturity. And I was looking at how that compared with the enterprise architecture maturity framework of the federal government. So I already had some subset of data, and Kalle helped in gathering the rest of the data. So we went through a number of sources to gather this data. And this is the kind of data we got. Now, the NM means there was no measure. The reason why there's no measure in this, or rather, let me say, the reason why there's a gap here is because the Government Accountability Office only conducted audits in this year, and that year, and that year. So there were no measures for funding, skilled resources, but these were program level. But for everything else, we were able to obtain, and there are so many people to thank for this. But let's look at the sample. We had 123 programs in our research sample. That was about 75%. 60 had e-government initiatives, and 60 had none. And 45 were at least maturity level 4 and above, while the others were maturity level 3 and below. So we conducted some regression testing. And, you know, statistics is a very good tool. It can be worth 1,000 words for as long as you remove that geekish language of chi-square and covariance and all those difficult terminologies they bring into the mix. But primarily, these were the most prevalent factors. Now, I want you to notice one thing. Culture. The literature told us at the adoption stage, culture was one of the most powerful. But look at this. The significance here is, even though it is there, it is weak. Anything above 0.050 means that it only explains at 90% confidence level. So we figured there was no need of carrying that forward. We wanted those which were below 0.050 because that's what accounts for significance. So what did we find? For organizational complexity, remember we had 4 factors? Only 2 turned out to be significant. I'll explain this in the next slide, so don't worry about this for now. For organizational environment, only autonomy was found to be significant. Now, these are predictive power. And then, for the program challenges, skilled resources and funding. Now remember, parochialism or culture is in parentheses because even though it was significant, we said it was weak. This is a snapshot of the results. But I won't dwell too much on this because the next slide will explain it, and we'll come back to this because this will be the closing slide. And there's a story to tell about this. But just at a very high level, functional diversity had a positive relationship with mission diversity. Diversity itself had with functional diversity. Now, negative relationship. You know, I have a problem with some researchers that seem to bury negative relations. Whenever they get negative results, they bury them under the carpet. I have a problem with that because I personally believe, and I'm sure so many of you will agree, sometimes those negative results tell us something. Maybe it's how not to do something. We don't just want to know how to do it. What about how not to do it? And then down here we had negative relationship, which is correlated with that. And then for the characteristics, we had those two as defining characteristics. So for the relationship between assimilation levels and performance, we use time series. And we used what we call time-lagged variables. Time-lagged variable means we are going to look at 3-year periods. So we are going to split the data into 3-year time frames. And there was a rationale for that. One was Ginny. In Ginny's book, she says that it takes about 5 years to mature from one stage to the other. Is that right, Ginny? You can correct me if I'm wrong here. Okay. And then also Ginny wrote that the DC government took approximately 6 years to make a transition. So we wanted to use that kind of time frame, but on a practical basis, when you implement anything or install a new system, you expect to get some time for it to mature. You need some time for it to integrate, and so we wanted to give that reasonable time period. And then most importantly, we wanted to control for past performance. So what that meant is that if we were looking at the performance of, say, 2005 to 2007, we were going to use the performance of 3 years before to see if there was any growth in there. And we also wanted to use the assimilation levels of 3 years before and regress it against the current performance to see if there was really any impact. That was the best way to do it. So we used time series. And this is what we found. So when we used 2002, 2004 as the dependent variable, and we used previous year simulation scores, guess what happened? And previous performance, it was significant. And then we tested again with the second data set. So we wanted to go, so that, the reason why we're doing this is because we wanted to go, we wanted to use the data before the introduction of e-government. And then we wanted to see the significance of it. Then we went and took 2005 to 2007, and then we regressed against previous and wanted to look at the data. Now, look at the difference between that and that. This means it's far more significant. Even though they're both significant, but this is far more significant. Yes, and the beta was much higher, if you looked at that. Then, if you look at this is institutional pressure. It was also significant. So which means we were starting to see, the data was starting to tell us, ladies and gentlemen, that yes, that investment was paying off. Somehow we could be able to see, now that we're regressing against past performance, past assimilation, we were starting to see that it was actually driving something. But that's just statistics. What did it tell us? Now, this slide here, I have to take a few seconds to explain. Remember we had, at the start of the research, we had a set of hypotheses. Even though we had discovered something new, we still wanted to go back and test those hypotheses because that's what research is about. We still need to go disapprove or approve of those hypotheses. So, proposition 1A, we said only mission and functional diversity were found to influence assimilation levels. And then this I think we've already talked about. And so I don't think I want to repeat myself too much here because I already spoke about it earlier. Now, these findings were rather interesting. Don't forget the context. We are talking about the federal government. We are talking about an innovation that's introduced via mandate, and there was uniform implementation, there was uniform diffusion, and they are also going to use uniform measures. So it's a one-size-fits-all approach. And what did we find? In complex organizations such as the government, mission and functional diversity were the strongest predictors. What does that tell us? What that tells us is that if you've got so many business units and you take the mission as a focus of your assimilation, you're bound to get better results. So you can focus on mission and the functions. Because remember, we're not adopting, we're not diffusing, we are assimilating. And remember, we are assimilating and we are trying to align with the mission. So the statistics were telling us exactly that again, that the mission, if it's the focus, then you're bound to get the results. Now, and these were for the complex organizations. The autonomous organizations, skilled resources turned out to be the better predictors. We'll talk about this in the next slide, but I just want you to bear in mind this. The institution of pressure was established to be a strong amplifier of that relationship. But we had another surprise here, that this pressure also had a catalytic effect. That was a big surprise because we thought we'd just end up there. So it not only amplifies, it also catalyzes. We already talked about this. And then autonomy had a negative relationship. So what this means is that autonomous agencies, when we looked at the data again, we found that most of the autonomous agencies didn't have too many functional units. There was a lot of concentration. And then assimilation had a powerful influence. This is a rather interesting slide because this starts to give us the meat of the research. Because when you start looking at those interactions and see exactly how some of those factors, remember our unit of analysis was the EA programs. So now we are interested in, when we look at those programs, what are the factors in those program challenges that can actually influence EA assimilation? And remember that in the program challenges, we had 4 factors. Now we are only left with 2, and that is funding and skilled resources. So what that tells us is that either availability or unavailability of funding can affect, or availability or unavailability of skilled resources can affect assimilation levels. So this is what we found. Oops. We found that funding only partially accounts for the relationship between these 2 factors. That means that if you're going to use the missions as the focus and you throw tons of money, it won't give you an instant result. It will only partially account for what will really drive successful assimilation. Funding also only partially accounts for the relationship between autonomy. So even if you're an autonomous organization and you throw tons of money, you're only going to get partial results. Funding fully accounts for the relationship between diversity and assimilation. Now, this was interesting. Here we've seen mission diversity is different from functional diversity. But this is a layer lower than that. And yet, this relationship, if you give funding to the functional units, you're bound to get better results than trying to give it at the mission. Why? Because the mission has several functions. So the distribution might not be even. So you need to look at each and every function and see what's the appropriate level of funding they need. And you can get better results that way rather than just splashing at the mission level. Skilled resources only partially account for the relationship between that, which means that even if you've got the functional level focus and you throw skilled resources, you still only get partial results. And skilled resources are a key ingredient in autonomous organizations. Let me qualify that point. So we've talked of the autonomous organizations. The ones that come to mind are the US Postal Service, which is one. We've talked about the IRS. They have money. They deal directly with the public. They get their money directly from the public. So funding is not a big deal for them. What's the big deal for them is that these kind of organizations typically are far more efficient. They might have a smaller workforce. So they might not have as many bodies to throw to enterprise architecture programs, right? But when we're looking at the more complex organizations, what does that tell you? There's a lower level of automation. So you might find they're bloated with a huge workforce. They don't mind throwing as many bodies as possible. That's why you're seeing the difference there. So what we are saying is that skilled resources being a key ingredient here, it means that autonomous organizations, since they already have money, the biggest deficit they're having is the skilled resources. Where do they get them from? Either they have to hire consultants, or they have to go out in the market and hire. And that's the difference here. And then skilled resources alone do not account for the relationship between mission and EA assimilation. And that makes sense, because what we're saying here is that even though the missions have some skilled resources, still remember that some of those, we've already said that some of the agencies or departments already have multiple missions. We already mentioned the Department of Commerce. So you have the weather NOAA, which is the weather agency, and you've got the, say, the Census Bureau. You see, they've got two different missions. So yeah, just throwing bodies at the department level is not going to help, because then you've not identified the varying requirements for each of those. So it will only give you partial. Now, this, we already talked about it, because there was carrot and stick. You comply, you get good grades, you get a good name, you're a star. You don't comply, we'll get you sanctions. So what's the conclusion that we came to? And this backs up what Ginny said. Higher assimilation is a great influencer. Ginny talked about stage 4, maturity stage 4. You're starting to talk about ROI. That's the language of the business. That's what the business wants to hear. After all that investment, can you come back with them, to them and tell them, look, this is the value add. There's better processes, they're more efficient, we are more effective, this is how much we save. That's the language you're talking at maturity level 5. So it's much easier to demonstrate that value. And you're driving mission. If you don't believe me, ask Blockbuster. Ask, what's the company that went bankrupt the other day? Borders. They put EA away. As a matter of fact, I was telling Ginny today, I think in 2006, we presented a proposal to Blockbuster for video as a service in a hosted model. They never even listened to us. We came back a second and a third time, they threw us out. In 2009, we got a call. That was too late. Complex organizations may need to adopt mission focus. Now, please, ladies and gentlemen, remember this. Mission, mission, mission. For assimilation, we are talking mission. As long as you maintain that focus of mission, aligning to mission, then you can avoid the pitfalls that Ginny was talking about, where there's a mismatch between the 3-year strategy cycles and the 5 years and the 20 years. The mission and the vision, once they're aligned, and that's what you've got your sights on, you get the results. Funding is more critical than skilled resources in functionally diverse organizations. I think we've already discussed this. And then we said skilled resources in autonomous organizations, I think we already talked about that. And then sustained pressure. Now, let me qualify that word sustained. The one thing that the OMB introduced that made a huge difference was that they introduced quarterly reviews. Now, that sounds so much like private sector. But that was a huge change from the GAO. The GAO audited almost every other 3, and not very regularly. They audited in 99 and then 2001. Then there was a push for 2003 and then 2006. Just look at that time lag. How do you expect to get results with those kind of time lags? But OMB introduced quarterly measures. So you had to produce plans and show alignment with your organization's mission. How was it contributing to better performance every quarter? So that was sustained, that constant monitoring. And then program challenges do not hinder assimilation once the pressure is sustained. So regardless of how much squabbling you're having within those programs, as long as the executive focus is there, you're constantly monitoring, you're constantly pushing for results, regardless of that squabbling, you'll get results. Now, let's go back to this slide here. Yes, just very quickly. And this is a very primitive method that I'm going to use here. And there are some statisticians here who might agree or disagree with me, but it's primitive, but it's practical. Let's just look at the P values, the probability values. If we are to look at the P values here, what you're going to see is that that is 0.0, which is the highest, then followed by 11, then followed by 0.26, and then followed by 47. What does that tell you? The primitive interpretation here is that if you've got a complex organization and you're coming up with a strategy for assimilation, start with mission. That's the highest. Then align it with the functions. That was the next. Give them funding. Then grant them autonomy. Once you grant them autonomy, they will find the skilled resources. That would be the primitive way to look at it, but that almost logically tells you how to follow it through. Start with the mission. Look at the mission. What is the functional structure? Follow that. What are their funding needs? Provide it. Give them autonomy, because once you grant them autonomy, you're out of the picture. It's up to them to get the resources they need. And that, to me, sounded like a winning formula. And with that, I'll be entertaining questions. Now, I hope the statistics part did not scare anybody. And I know Jeannie's didn't have as much statistics, and I know Jeannie has star power, but still, I would entertain any questions. Any questions? Going one? Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. You know, that's an interesting question. Private sector organizations very rarely share the amount of data that we have, and that was part of the impediment. It took roughly about 4 years for us to get this kind of data set. Actually, what triggered this was I attended a Chief Architects Forum in Washington, D.C. in 2005, and you could see the frustrated faces of chief architects. And they kept saying how underappreciated they were or unappreciated they were, and how much they had put a lifetime worth of work in this, and nobody ever seemed to appreciate the results. That's what drove me. But the private sector, no. I mean, it's been very hard getting anybody to cooperate. I mean, honestly speaking, who would come to you and tell us, tell you we failed in this? You know, that's really hard to get that kind of. But some government officials, in fact, most of the ones we found were retired. So they were more than willing to tell us some of the facts we really needed to hear. Right. I appreciate that point. Oh, yeah. Okay. So the gentleman here said that in any case, the government could be the worst case scenario. So if you can find results there, then I'm sure you can relate it to the private sector. Yes, sir. Oh, you think? Okay. Interesting. Interesting. Yes, sir.
Can you comment on how the culture between all the agencies and bureaus was, if they all had their own CIOs, their own data centers, their own sourcing, their own strategies before? How is it that the mandate changed the culture to get everybody to behave?
You know, that's a very good question. I'm glad that you asked that question. Yes. Did everyone hear the question? Oh, Jesus. So you might have to stand. Okay. Okay, so he's asking how the appointment of CIOs and getting them to drive, and I hope I'm rephrasing correctly, whether that made an impact or it made a difference in the assimilation. And the reason why I say that's a very good question is this. The Klinger-Cohen Act of 1996 did mandate the federal agencies to introduce the position, or rather to create the position of a CIO and a chief enterprise architect. Now, these were foreign titles in government. These were private sector titles. How does a director of an agency go appointing a chief information officer, a chief architect? They didn't want to do that. That was giving away power. And like I said, there was impunity. If they didn't appoint, who cared? So most of them actually resisted creating those positions. And that's what we found when we went out for the qualitative research phase, that there was a lot of frustration. Some of the quotes we got were that even after they were appointed, some didn't have offices, others were never given anything to do. In fact, some had to create their own titles of chief information officer and printed own cards. They were using their own money to print cards as a matter of self-esteem and trying to impose themselves. So, I mean, there was a lot of hurdles. I wish I could share with you a lot of that. But to answer your question, those agencies that embraced it, and most of those were the autonomous agencies, those that embraced it did get results. The DoD for a long time had a single CIO, and the CIO served for a tenure of 2 years. So every 2 years there was rotation. So, I mean, that's, and we are talking of 3 million employees, okay, 1.5 million active and 1.5 on the reserves. But can you imagine serving 3 million people with one CIO, and there's all these centers of power? So, okay, eventually they devolved gradually. Now there's a Navy CIO and whatever. But to answer your question, those that did, in fact, implement the Klinger-Cohen Act in its entirety did see tremendous growth because they were better able to identify the requirements from a business perspective, not an IT perspective. Because the Act said IT architecture. So a political appointee looks at it and says, IT architecture, okay, this belongs under IT, and throws it over the fence. So, and whom do you find in the IT departments in federal government? Programmers, right? You'll find hardware specialists, and those are the people who characterize the IT environment. So when you're taking it there, how do you expect them to have that broad view or enterprise-wide view to implement enterprise architecture? So to answer your question, yes, it did make a difference. Okay. Looks like I'm off the hook, huh? Okay.